A clash of perceptions. Captain Simone Williams was the epitome of resilience and leadership, a name spoken with respect in police departments across the city. Her rise to the rank of captain was a testament to years of hard work, unwavering determination, and an unshakable commitment to justice. As one of the few black women to achieve such a position, her journey had been anything but easy. Simone had faced the double-edged sword of racism and sexism in a system that wasn't built to accommodate someone like her, but she met those challenges head-on, letting her integrity and actions speak louder than words. Unlike many who climbed the ranks, Simone never distanced herself from the community she served. Despite her position, she refused to adopt an air of superiority. She drove a modest sit-in, preferred plain clothes when off-duty, and made it a point to engage with residents in the neighborhoods her precinct protected. Her philosophy was simple. A badge wasn't a shield. It was a promise. This particular evening was supposed to be the end of a grueling week. Simone had spent long hours juggling operational meetings, overseeing active investigations, and handling administrative duties that came with her rank. By the time she left the station, it was nearly 9:30 p.m., and her fatigue was palpable. Her navy uniform, though sharp and crisp in the morning, now felt heavy on her shoulders. All she wanted was to go home, pour herself a cup of tea, and put the week behind her. As she drove through the quiet streets on the city's outskirts, her car's fuel light blinked on. A quick glance at the dashboard told her she wouldn't make it home without stopping for gas. Spotting a dimly lit gas station, Simone sighed and pulled in. She knew the area. It wasn't the safest part of town, but she'd patrolled these streets enough times to feel at ease. Besides, she was still in uniform. The badge on her chest and the authority it represented often acted as a deterrent to trouble. Simone stepped out of her car and began fueling, her mind wandering to the weekend ahead. She planned to spend it catching up on rest and reading, a rare indulgence in her otherwise hectic life. But as she stood by her car, the distant glow of headlights in her rearview mirror caught her attention. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled in behind her, its red and blue lights flashing. Simone's heart sank. She wasn't a stranger to situations like these. Despite her rank and accomplishments, she had been stopped unnecessarily on more than one occasion, and the experience was always laced with tension. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared for yet another encounter where her identity would be questioned simply because of how she looked. Officer Mike Brennan exited the patrol car with the confidence of someone who believed he had the upper hand. A white man in his mid-30s, Brennan had been with the force for nearly a decade. Once ambitious, he had grown bitter over the years as his career stagnated. His frustration with his personal and professional life had curdled into a toxic mix of entitlement and prejudice, and his approach to policing reflected it. To Brennan, certain neighborhoods equated to trouble, and certain people in those neighborhoods equated to guilt. From his vantage point, Simone was just another suspicious individual, a black woman in a part of town he associated with crime. He didn't recognize the authority her uniform symbolized, nor did he bother to look closely enough to notice the captain's insignia on her chest. For Brennan, the uniform didn't matter. Her skin color did. Evening. Brennan barked as he approached, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His posture was rigid, his voice sharp, and his demeanor radiated intimidation. Simone turned to face him, her expression calm but weary. "Evening, officer," she replied, her tone measured. She knew exactly where this was heading, and she was too tired to dance around it. "You got any reason to be in this area tonight?" Brennan demanded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her from head to toe. Simone raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm just stopping for gas." "Is there a problem?" Brennan ignored her question, his suspicion mounting. "You live around here?" Simone paused, weighing her words carefully. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken accusations woven into his tone. "No, officer," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "But I wasn't aware I needed to justify stopping for gas." Brennan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he'd already decided didn't belong. You know this area's been under surveillance, right? A lot of criminal activity lately. Mind stepping away from the car for a second? Simone sighed internally. She dealt with officers like Brennan before, men who wielded their authority like a weapon, more interested in asserting dominance than serving justice. She glanced at the gas pump, still fueling her car, and decided to hold her ground. "Officer," she said, her voice firm but not confrontational, "I've done nothing wrong. I'm simply fueling my car. If there's a valid reason for this interaction, I'd like to know what it is." Brennan's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't accustomed to people standing up to him, and Simone's refusal to comply without question only fueled his frustration. "License and registration," he snapped, his tone growing harsher. Simone paused, her eyes locking onto his. She was within her rights to refuse. She knew that. But she also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, especially when the officer in question was already on edge. Without a word, she reached into her car and retrieved her documents, handing them over calmly. Brennan snatched them from her hand, barely glancing at the license before fixating on her with renewed suspicion. He didn't see the name printed clearly on the card, nor did he register the badge number listed alongside it. His mind was already made up. She was guilty of something, and he was going to find out what. "What's in the car?" he demanded, his hand still resting on his holster. Simone raised both eyebrows this time, her patience thinning. "Excuse me?" "I asked what's in the car," Brennan repeated, his tone aggressive. "Pop the trunk." Simone straightened her posture, her calm exterior giving way to a quiet but undeniable authority. "Officer, I've complied with your requests, and I've been more than patient. But unless you have probable cause or a warrant, I'm under no obligation to let you search my vehicle." Brennan's face flushed with anger. "You think you're above the law," he snapped. Simone didn't flinch. "No, officer. I think I know the law. And I suggest you take a closer look at my license before you proceed any further." For the first time, Brennan hesitated. He glanced down at the license in his hand, his eyes scanning the name and badge number. Slowly, realization began to dawn on him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Captain Simone Williams," he read aloud, his voice faltering slightly. Simone crossed her arms, her expression cool and composed. "That's correct. And I'd like to know why one of my officers is detaining me without cause." Brennan's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to form a response. The balance of power had shifted dramatically, and he was no longer in control of the situation. Around them, a few other cars had pulled into the gas station, their drivers watching the scene unfold with interest. Simone took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "This interaction is over, Officer Brennan. I suggest you return to your vehicle and think very carefully about your actions moving forward." Brennan nodded stiffly, his face red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Without another word, he handed her license and registration back and retreated to his patrol car. Simone watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't the end of the matter. Brennan's behavior couldn't go unchecked. But for tonight, she was satisfied with holding her ground and asserting the authority she had rightfully earned. As she finished fueling her car and drove away, Simone couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. It was a stark reminder that no matter how far she'd risen, the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. But she also knew this: she wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. The uneasy aftermath. Captain Simone Williams drove away from the gas station, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The encounter with Officer Mike Brennan replayed in her mind on a loop, the aggression in his stance, the condescension in his tone, and the way he dismissed her rank until forced to confront it. She exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the tension, but her mind wouldn't let her. How many others had Brennan treated like this? She couldn't ignore the reality that her rank had saved her from further humiliation, but not everyone would have had that same protection. Simone's thoughts shifted to the broader implications. This wasn't just about one officer. Brennan's behavior hinted at something deeper, a toxic culture within the department, one that allowed prejudice and abuse of power to fester unchecked. It wasn't new to her. She'd spent her career fighting it, pushing for reforms and accountability at every level. But this encounter felt personal, and she knew she couldn't let it slide. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the exhaustion of the week had returned in full force. Simone sat in her car for a moment, staring at the modest house she'd worked so hard to maintain. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could leave the chaos of her job behind. But tonight, even the warm glow of the porch light couldn't soothe her. Inside, she poured herself a cup of tea and sank into the worn armchair by the window. Her mind raced as she mentally drafted the report she would file about Brennan's behavior. She knew it would ruffle feathers. Officers like Brennan didn't exist in isolation. They were often protected by unspoken alliances within the department. But Simone had built her career on doing what was right, not what was easy. This would be no exception. The next morning, Simone arrived at her precinct earlier than usual, her sharp navy uniform freshly pressed, and her badge polished to perfection. She was greeted by nods and murmured good mornings from her team as she made her way to her office. Despite the lingering fatigue, she carried herself with the same calm authority that had earned her respect across the department. As she settled behind her desk, she began drafting her report about the previous night's encounter. She was meticulous, detailing every word, action, and nuance of the interaction. Simone knew that her report would need to be airtight. Any gaps or ambiguities could be used to dismiss her claims. Halfway through, her phone buzzed. It was Sergeant Rachel Torres, one of the most dependable officers under her command. "Good morning, Captain," Torres said, her tone professional but warm. "There's something you should see." Simone frowned slightly. "What's going on?" "It's about Officer Brennan," Torres replied. "I think you should come to the briefing room." Simone's heart sank slightly. What now? She saved her report and made her way to the briefing room, where Torres stood by a laptop connected to the precinct's projector. Several other officers were seated, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. "What is this about, Sergeant?" Simone asked, keeping her tone neutral. Torres gestured to the screen. "One of the patrol car's dashboard cameras recorded something last night. I think you'll want to see it." Simone's chest tightened as Torres hit play. The footage showed Brennan's interaction with her at the gas station, captured from his cruiser's dashboard cam. Every word, every movement, every flicker of disdain in Brennan's tone was laid bare. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably as the video played, some exchanging uneasy glances. When the footage ended, the room fell silent. Simone's face was calm, but her eyes betrayed a simmering anger. She turned to Torres. "How did you get this?" Torres hesitated. "The tech team flagged it during routine checks this morning. Brennan never logged the stop in his report, which is a violation. When I saw the footage, I knew you needed to see it." Simone nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Sergeant. Leave this with me." Torres handed her a USB drive containing the footage, then left the room, leaving Simone alone with the lingering tension. She replayed the video in her mind, her resolve hardening. Brennan hadn't just overstepped, he'd abused his authority. And he'd done so with the confidence that there would be no consequences. That confidence, Simone decided, was about to be shattered. By mid-morning, Simone requested a meeting with Captain Mark Hayes, the officer overseeing Brennan's precinct. Hayes was an old-school cop, respected for his experience, but known for his resistance to change. Simone had dealt with him before, and while their interactions were cordial, she knew this conversation would be a challenge. In Hayes's office, Simone laid out the details of the encounter, presenting her report alongside the dashboard footage. Hayes watched the video in silence, his expression unreadable. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "This doesn't look good," Hayes admitted, though his tone lacked urgency. "But Brennan's been with the force for a long time. He's made mistakes, sure, but he's a decent cop at heart." Simone's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. Captain, this isn't just a mistake. This is a pattern of behavior that reflects poorly on the entire department. If he's willing to treat a fellow officer, his superior, with this level of disrespect, how do you think he treats civilians? Hayes frowned. You're suggesting he's a bad cop. I'm suggesting he's a liability, Simone replied firmly. And if this footage gets out, it won't just be Brennan's reputation on the line. It'll be ours. Hayes leaned forward, his expression hardening. What exactly are you proposing? An internal investigation, Simone said without hesitation. Brennan's actions need to be reviewed, and if this isn't an isolated incident, appropriate disciplinary measures need to be taken. Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. You know this isn't going to be popular. Brennan has allies in the department. They won't take kindly to one of their own being investigated. Simone's gaze didn't waver. I'm not here to be popular, Captain. I'm here to ensure that we uphold the values we claim to represent. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the public to trust us? Hayes studied her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. All right. I'll authorize the investigation, but you'd better be prepared for the fallout. The next few days were tense as the investigation into Brennan's conduct began. Simone knew that the decision to pursue accountability wouldn't sit well with everyone, and she was right. Whispers and side glances followed her through the precinct, and she could feel the undercurrent of resistance growing. But amidst the tension, there were also glimmers of support. Officers like Torres quietly expressed their gratitude for her leadership, and a few even shared their own experiences of Brennan's behavior, further validating her decision to act. As the investigation unfolded, Simone remained steadfast, her calm demeanor a source of strength for those who believed in her vision of justice. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew this: change never came easily, and she wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. Little did Simone know, the investigation was about to uncover something far deeper than she'd anticipated, something that would shake the department to its core. The storm beneath the surface. The investigation into Officer Brennan's conduct gained momentum faster than Captain Simone Williams had anticipated. By the third day, Internal Affairs had begun their review of the dashcam footage, and whispers spread through the precinct like wildfire. Brennan, who had carried himself with smug confidence up until this point, now walked the halls with a tense, defensive posture. He wasn't used to being held accountable, and it showed. Simone, on the other hand, kept her focus razor-sharp. She wasn't interested in petty office politics or the rumors swirling around her. The facts were clear. Brennan's behavior was a liability not just to the department, but to the very communities they were sworn to serve. For Simone, this was bigger than one officer. This was about dismantling a culture that allowed such misconduct to thrive in the first place. That morning, Simone sat in her office reviewing personnel files when there was a knock at her door. She looked up to see Sergeant Rachel Torres, who had been instrumental in bringing the dashcam footage to her attention. Torres' expression was serious, her usual warmth replaced with a quiet determination. Captain, Torres began as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. There's something you should know. It's about Brennan. Simone gestured for her to sit. Go on. Torres hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I've been digging into his patrol logs from the past 6 months. There are inconsistencies. Simone raised an eyebrow. What kind of inconsistencies? Torres handed her a file. Frequent stops in certain neighborhoods, but no formal reports filed. High interaction rates with civilians, but no recorded citations or arrests. And then there are the complaints. Simone flipped through the file, her jaw tightening as she read. Civilian complaints about racial profiling, excessive use of force, intimidation tactics. Most of them had been filed anonymously, which wasn't uncommon given the fear many felt when reporting police misconduct. What was alarming, however, was the fact that none of the complaints had been properly investigated. This is worse than I thought, Simone muttered, her tone heavy. Torres nodded. I spoke to a few officers who've worked with Brennan on patrol. They didn't want to go on record, but they confirmed that he has a pattern of targeting people in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. He rarely calls anything in, but they've seen him intimidate people during stops. It's like he's trying to scare them into submission. Simone's hands tightened around the file. And no one's reported this before. Not officially, Torres admitted. He's got friends in the department. People who cover for him look the other way. It's the unspoken rule. Don't rock the boat. Simone closed the file, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Brennan anymore. If he had allies within the department, this behavior wasn't an isolated issue. It was systemic. "Thank you, Sergeant," Simone said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Keep digging. If you find anything else, bring it to me immediately." By mid-afternoon, Simone decided it was time to confront Brennan directly. She knew it was a calculated risk. He was already under investigation, and any confrontation could escalate the situation. But Simone wasn't one to shy away from difficult conversations. She needed to gauge his response, to see if he would crack under pressure. She found Brennan in the break room, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. His expression was guarded, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw her approach. "Captain," he said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. "Officer Brennan," Simone replied evenly. "Do you have a moment?" He straightened, setting his coffee cup down. "Of course." Simone gestured toward a nearby conference room. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to face him. "I'll get straight to the point. The dashcam footage from our interaction at the gas station has raised serious concerns, not just about that night, but about your conduct overall." Brennan's jaw tightened. "I've already explained that stop. I was patrolling a high-crime area, and your presence seemed suspicious. I was doing my job." "Was it your job to approach me with your hand on your holster?" Simone countered, her tone sharp but controlled. "Was it your job to escalate a routine stop into an unnecessary confrontation?" Brennan's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Simone said, her voice rising slightly. "You didn't take the time to find out. You saw a Black woman in a certain part of town, and you made assumptions. Those assumptions led to misconduct, and based on what I've uncovered so far, this isn't the first time." Brennan's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "I don't know what you're talking about." Simone took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "Don't insult my intelligence, officer. Your patrol logs are riddled with inconsistencies. Complaints have been filed against you for racial profiling and intimidation. And now, with internal affairs involved, all of it is coming to light." Brennan's composure cracked slightly, his voice lowering to a defensive growl. "This is a witch hunt. You're just trying to make an example out of me because I embarrassed you." Simone's expression didn't waver. "This isn't about me, Brennan. It's about the people we serve. It's about the integrity of this department. If you think you can hide behind your badge, you're mistaken." For a moment, Brennan said nothing, his fists clenched at his sides. Then he smirked, though the gesture lacked conviction. "We'll see about that, Captain." Simone held his gaze. "Yes, we will." After the meeting, Simone returned to her office, her mind racing. Brennan's reaction had confirmed her suspicions. He was defensive, evasive, and clearly worried about what the investigation would uncover. But it also raised a troubling question. How far would he, and those protecting him, go to keep their secrets buried? Later that evening, Sergeant Torres knocked on her door, a stack of files in hand. "Captain, I found something else." Simone gestured for her to sit. "What is it?" Torres opened one of the files, revealing copies of financial records. "Brennan's been taking overtime shifts, but the hours don't match up with his patrol logs. And then there's this. Transactions from his personal bank account. Large deposits, all in cash, made shortly after some of his late-night shifts." Simone's stomach sank. "Are you saying he's taking bribes?" "It's possible," Torres replied. "The patterns are consistent, And if he's involved in something like this, he's not working alone. Simone leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they painted was damning. Brennan wasn't just a bad cop. He was part of something much larger. "Keep this quiet for now," Simone said. "We need to build a stronger case before we act. But once we have enough evidence." Torres nodded, her expression resolute. "Understood, Captain." As Torres left, Simone stared at the files on her desk, the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew this. She had a responsibility to see this through, no matter the cost. This wasn't just about Brennan anymore. It was about exposing the rot that had taken hold within the department and tearing it out at the root. Shadows of corruption. Captain Simone Williams couldn't shake the growing weight of the evidence piling up against Officer Mike Brennan. It was no longer just about his behavior at the gas station. It was about a pattern of misconduct that pointed to something far deeper and darker within the precinct. The financial irregularities, the unreported stops, the anonymous complaints, all of it painted a picture of a man who had abused his authority for years, hiding behind a badge that he tarnished with every bad decision. But Brennan wasn't the type to act alone. Simone knew that officers like him thrived in environments where their actions were either ignored or tacitly condoned. If he had allies, and the pattern strongly suggested he did, they wouldn't go down without a fight. That morning, Simone called for an emergency meeting with Internal Affairs and Captain Mark Hayes, who oversaw Brennan's precinct. The room was tense as Simone presented the new findings Sergeant Torres had uncovered: financial records, inconsistencies in patrol logs, and evidence of possible bribery. Hayes, seated at the far end of the table, leaned back in his chair with a deep frown. "This is getting out of hand," Hayes muttered, rubbing his temples. "You're suggesting Brennan's not only been abusing his authority, but also taking bribes. That's a serious accusation, Captain Williams." "It's not an accusation, Captain Hayes," Simone replied firmly. "It's a fact. The evidence speaks for itself. Brennan's been operating outside the bounds of the law, and he's not doing it alone. The question now is, how deep does this go?" The representative from Internal Affairs, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Lisa Ramirez, nodded in agreement. "Captain Williams is right. This isn't just about one officer. The patterns in Brennan's logs suggest coordination. Someone else is feeding him information, covering for him, or both. We need to widen the scope of this investigation." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "You do realize what you're proposing, don't you? If word gets out that this precinct has corruption at its core, it'll destroy morale, not to mention public trust." Simone's eyes narrowed. "And if we ignore it, Captain Hayes, what happens then? How many more civilians will suffer because we were too afraid to clean house?" The room fell silent, the weight of Simone's words hanging in the air. Finally, Hayes sighed and nodded reluctantly. "Fine. What's your plan?" Simone leaned forward, her voice steady and determined. "We need to put Brennan under surveillance, discreetly. Monitor his movements, track his communications, and see who he's working with. But we also need to protect the officers who are willing to come forward. This can't work without their cooperation." Ramirez nodded. "I'll assign a team to handle the surveillance. As for the whistleblowers, we'll make sure their identities are protected." "Good," Simone said, her tone resolute. "Let's get to work." Later that day, Simone met with Sergeant Rachel Torres in her office. Torres had been instrumental in uncovering the evidence against Brennan, and Simone trusted her implicitly. But she also knew the risks Torres was taking by aligning herself with this investigation. "How are you holding up, Sergeant?" Simone asked as Torres sat down across from her. Torres shrugged, though her expression was tense. "I'm fine, Captain. Just cautious. I've heard the whispers. Some of the officers aren't happy about what we're doing." Simone nodded, her expression softening. "That's to be expected. But I want you to know that I have your back, no matter what." Torres smiled faintly. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot." They spent the next hour reviewing the latest findings from internal affairs. Brennan's financial records were damning. But the most troubling revelation was a series of encrypted messages retrieved from his phone. The messages suggested coordination with at least 2 other officers, though their identities were still unknown. The language was vague, intentionally so, but the intent was clear. They were involved in something illegal, and they were careful to cover their tracks. "What do we do now?" Torres asked as they finished reviewing the files. Simon's gaze hardened. "We follow the trail. These messages are the key to unraveling this network, but we need to be smart about how we proceed. One wrong move, and they'll go underground." That evening, Simon received a call from Detective Ramirez. The internal affairs team had intercepted another suspicious communication from Brennan, this time detailing a planned drop at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The message was cryptic, but clear enough to suggest that Brennan would be meeting someone there to exchange cash. Simon immediately mobilized a small team, handpicking officers he knew she could trust, including Torres. They would surveil the warehouse and gather evidence, ensuring they had enough to bring Brennan and his accomplices down once and for all. By the time they arrived at the location, the sun had set, and the warehouse was shrouded in darkness. Simon and her team set up a perimeter, using unmarked vehicles and plainclothes officers to remain undetected. From her position in one of the cars, Simon watched the entrance of the warehouse through binoculars, her heart pounding with anticipation. Minutes turned into hours as they waited, the tension thick in the air. Finally, a car pulled up, a black sedan with tinted windows. Brennan stepped out, looking around nervously before entering the warehouse. Moments later, another car arrived, this one an expensive-looking SUV. 2 men in suits emerged, carrying a briefcase. Simon's grip on the binoculars tightened. "There it is," she muttered. "We've got them." Through the binoculars, she watched as the men exchanged what appeared to be a large stack of cash. Brennan handed them an envelope, which one of the men inspected before nodding. The entire transaction lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was enough. "Move in," Simon ordered, her voice steady but firm. The team moved quickly, surrounding the warehouse and blocking the exits. Simon entered with Torres and Ramirez, their weapons drawn as they confronted Brennan and the 2 men. "Hands where we can see them," Simon shouted, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. Brennan froze, his face pale as he realized the trap had sprung. The 2 men hesitated for a moment before raising their hands, their expressions a mix of anger and fear. As Torres cuffed Brennan, Simon stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Officer Brennan, you are under arrest for bribery, misconduct, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Brennan glared at her, his defiance flickering. "You don't know what you're doing, Williams. You think this ends with me. You're in over your head." Simon's gaze didn't waver. "We'll see about that." By the time they returned to the precinct, Brennan and the 2 men were in custody, and the evidence collected from the warehouse was being processed. Simon knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of victory. As she sat in her office, reviewing the initial reports, Torres knocked on the door. "Captain," she said, her tone cautious, "I think you should see this." Simon frowned as Torres handed her a file. Inside were documents linking Brennan to another officer, one of Simon's own team members. Her heart sank. "It's worse than I thought," she murmured. Torres nodded. "What do we do now?" Simon's gaze hardened, her resolve unshaken. "We keep going. No matter what it takes, we're going to root this out. All of it." The storm beneath the surface was far from over, but Simon was ready to face it head-on. This wasn't just about cleaning up one precinct. It was about restoring trust in a system that had failed too many for too long. And Simon Williams was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The web unravels. The following morning, Captain Simone Williams arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, her mind racing from the revelations of the night before. Brennan's arrest had been a major win, but the discovery of another officer, one from her own team, being implicated in the conspiracy weighed heavily on her. This wasn't just an issue of misconduct. It was a coordinated effort, a web of corruption woven into the department she had worked so hard to reform. Simone stepped into her office, her coffee untouched on her desk, as she opened the file Sergeant Rachel Torres had handed her the night before. The implicated officer, Detective Martin Avery, had been with her precinct for nearly 8 years. On the surface, he was a model officer, highly decorated, respected by his peers, and known for his diligence. But the financial records and text messages uncovered by Internal Affairs painted a starkly different picture. Large, unexplained deposits in Avery's account. Frequent, encrypted messages exchanged with Brennan. Surveillance footage of him entering and leaving the Grayson warehouse, the same site tied to Brennan's activities. The evidence was damning, and yet Simone struggled to reconcile it with the man she thought she knew. By mid-morning, Simone called an emergency meeting with Internal Affairs. Detective Lisa Ramirez, who had been leading the investigation, arrived with updates that added yet another layer of complexity. "We've confirmed that Detective Avery was acting as a middleman," Ramirez explained, spreading out photos and documents on Simone's desk. "He was funneling information about pending investigations and coordinating drop-offs between Brennan and several external players. This wasn't just about bribes. They were feeding sensitive information to organized crime syndicates." Simone's stomach tightened. "How far does this go?" Ramirez's expression was grim. "Farther than we initially thought. Avery isn't the only one. We've identified at least 2 other officers in your precinct who were likely complicit. We're still working to gather enough evidence to bring them in. But it's clear this was a network, not a one-man operation." Simone leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "And what about Avery? Have we brought him in yet?" Ramirez shook her head. "Not yet. We wanted to run it by you first. Given his position and influence, we thought it might be better for you to handle the arrest." Simone nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do it. If we're going to take this network apart, it starts with showing them that no one is untouchable." That afternoon, Simone called Detective Avery into her office under the guise of discussing an ongoing case. He entered with his usual calm demeanor, his confidence unshaken, as he took a seat across from her desk. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Avery asked, his tone polite but guarded. Simone studied him for a moment, searching his face for any hint of remorse or guilt. If he was aware of the investigation, he didn't show it. "Yes, Detective," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I wanted to discuss some inconsistencies in the reports you filed for the Grayson warehouse investigation." Avery raised an eyebrow, his posture relaxing slightly. "Grayson, I thought that case had been closed months ago." "It was," Simone replied. "But new information has come to light. Information that suggests you've been withholding critical details." For a brief moment, Avery's mask slipped. His eyes flickered with unease before he quickly recovered. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Captain." Simone leaned forward, her voice firm. "Detective Avery, we have evidence linking you to Officer Brennan's activities. Financial records, encrypted messages, surveillance footage. You've been implicated in a conspiracy that's jeopardized this department's integrity and put lives at risk." Avery's jaw tightened, his calm facade beginning to crack. "With all due respect, Captain, I think you're mistaken." "I'm not," Simone said sharply. She stood, her gaze unwavering as she walked around the desk to stand in front of him. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Avery. This is a betrayal, not just of me or this department, but of every officer who puts their life on the line to do this job with integrity." Avery said nothing, his eyes darting toward the door, as if calculating his next move. "You're under arrest," Simone said, her voice cold and unrelenting. "Stand up and place your hands where I can see them." For a moment, Avery didn't move, his defiance palpable. But as the door opened and Sergeant Torres stepped inside, her hand resting on the holster at her hip, he reluctantly complied. As Torres cuffed him, Simone stepped back, her expression unreadable. "Take him to holding," she instructed, "and make sure he knows his rights." The precinct buzzed with tension as news of Avery's arrest spread. Simone could feel the eyes of her officers on her as she walked through the halls, some filled with respect, others with suspicion. She knew that the arrests of Brennan and Avery were only the beginning. The web of corruption they were uncovering wouldn't untangle itself overnight, and there would be resistance, both from within and outside the department. Later that evening, Simone met with Ramirez and Torres to review the evidence against the other implicated officers. The pattern was clear. Brennan and Avery had acted as the primary facilitators, but their network extended to patrol officers, administrative staff, and even a few higher-ranking officials in neighboring precincts. "This isn't just about taking down individuals," Simone said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "This is about dismantling an entire system that allowed this corruption to thrive." Ramirez nodded. "Agreed, but it's going to get ugly. The deeper we dig, the more powerful the people we're going to expose." Simone leaned forward, her gaze fierce. "Let them come. We're not backing down." That night, as Simone sat in her office reviewing the day's developments, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Back off before it's too late." Simone stared at the message, her mind racing. She knew this was a threat, a warning from someone desperate to protect their secrets. But instead of fear, it filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She had come too far and uncovered too much to back down now. With a steady hand, she deleted the message and locked her phone. The road ahead would be dangerous, but Simone Williams wasn't one to run from a fight. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Because justice wasn't just her duty, it was her mission. And she wouldn't stop until every shadow of corruption in her department had been exposed to the light. The light of justice. Captain Simone Williams sat at her desk, the soft hum of the precinct settling around her as midnight approached. The precinct was quieter than usual, but the tension in the air was palpable. Two of her officers, Mike Brennan and Detective Martin Avery, were in holding cells, and the investigation into the broader corruption within the department was gaining momentum. Yet Simone knew this was just the beginning. Every step forward unearthed more layers of deceit, and the shadowy network of corruption stretched farther than anyone had anticipated. Her phone buzzed on the desk, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Detective Lisa Ramirez from Internal Affairs. "Captain," Ramirez said, her voice steady but urgent, "we've decrypted the rest of Avery's phone messages. There's a meeting happening tonight, midnight, at the old shipping yard. From the context, it sounds like some kind of payoff." Simone sat up straight. "Do we know who's involved?" "Not yet," Ramirez replied. "But the messages mention high-ranking individuals. This might be our only chance to catch them in the act." Simone's mind raced. The old shipping yard was a known hotspot for illegal activity, and if the meeting was happening as described, it was a golden opportunity to expose the remaining players in the network. But it was also dangerous. Whoever these individuals were, they wouldn't hesitate to protect themselves if cornered. "Mobilize a team," Simone said, "but keep it small and discreet. We can't risk tipping them off." Within 30 minutes, Simone had assembled a team of trusted officers, including Sergeant Rachel Torres and Detective Ramirez. They met in the briefing room, the tension thick as they laid out their plan. "We'll approach from 3 sides," Simone explained, pointing to a map of the shipping yard. "Torres, you'll take the north entrance with 2 officers. Ramirez and I will cover the south. The third team will secure the perimeter to ensure no one escapes. No one moves until I give the signal." The officers nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They knew the risks involved, but they also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about cleaning up the department. It was about restoring trust in the badge they wore. The shipping yard was dark and eerily quiet as Simone's team arrived, their unmarked vehicles blending into the shadows. Simone crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her eyes scanning the area through binoculars. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of headlights as a black SUV pulled into the yard. Two men stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the dim light. Moments later, another car arrived, followed by a third. From her position, Simone could make out a group of at least 6 men, their movements deliberate and guarded. Ramirez crouched beside her, her voice low. "Looks like a payoff. One of them's carrying a briefcase." Simone nodded, her pulse quickening. "Wait for my signal." She watched as the men began speaking, their voices too low to hear from a distance. One of them opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of cash. Another handed over a manila envelope, which was quickly tucked into the briefcase. The exchange was swift, but it was enough. "Now," Simone whispered into her radio. The team moved with precision, their footsteps silent as they closed in on the group. Torres and her team emerged from the north entrance, their weapons drawn, while Ramirez and Simone approached from the south. The third team secured the exits, blocking any chance of escape. "Police!" Simone shouted, her voice cutting through the stillness. Hands in the air. The men froze, their faces a mix of shock and anger. One of them, a tall, burly man in a suit, took a step back, his hand moving toward his waistband. "Don't even think about it," Torres barked, her weapon trained on him. One by one, the men complied, raising their hands as officers moved in to secure them. Simone approached the burly man, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. "Chief Donovan," she said coldly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Donovan, the head of a neighboring precinct, smirked despite his situation. "You're making a mistake, Williams." "No," Simone replied, her voice firm. "The mistake was thinking you could get away with this." By the time they returned to the precinct, it was nearly dawn. Donovan and the other men were processed and booked, and the evidence collected at the shipping yard, cash, documents, and encrypted devices, was handed over to Internal Affairs. Simone knew the arrests would send shockwaves through the department, but it was a necessary reckoning. As she sat in her office, reviewing the reports, Torres entered with a tired but triumphant smile. "We got them, Captain," Torres said, dropping a thick file onto Simone's desk. "The evidence is airtight. There's no way they're walking away from this." Simone nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. "Good work, Sergeant. This wouldn't have been possible without you." Torres hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know there's going to be backlash, right? Some people won't take kindly to this, especially with Donovan involved." "I know," Simone said, "but we didn't take this job to make friends. We took it to make a difference." In the days that followed, the arrests at the shipping yard dominated headlines. The public was shocked to learn of the corruption within the department, but there was also a sense of hope. Simone became a symbol of integrity, a leader who wasn't afraid to confront the flaws in the system she served. Brennan and Avery, along with the others implicated in the conspiracy, faced criminal charges. Donovan's arrest sent ripples through the law enforcement community, forcing many to confront the uncomfortable truth about the culture that had allowed such corruption to thrive. But for Simone, the work was far from over. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take years of rebuilding trust, implementing reforms, and holding people accountable. But she was ready. One evening, as Simone left the precinct, she paused to look at the city skyline. The weight of the past weeks still lingered, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. She had faced resistance, threats, and betrayal, but she had stood her ground. And in doing so, she had proven that justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a responsibility. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a message from Torres. It was simple but spoke volumes. "Thank you for leading the way." Simone smiled, her resolve renewed. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone. And as long as there were officers like Torres by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey. And Captain Simone Williams was determined to see it through to the end.